Okay, so in the last video we looked at positional arguments, which are very simple. We simply pass in an argument in the order in which the parameters are defined. Now, keyword arguments are a little bit different to positional arguments in that we don't have to pass them into the function in any order. What we do instead is we specify the name of the corresponding parameter, followed by an equal sign, and then we assign the respective value. So for example, if I call the welcome function utilizing keyword arguments, if I put first underscore name equals the string Dean, followed by a comma, and then put the parameter last underscore name equals Taylor, you can see that when I run this function, we get hello Dean Taylor, how are you? And we've passed in a value to a specific parameter. And this is what is known as a keyword argument. So I could, for example, copy and paste this function call, but this time define last underscore name first, followed by a comma, and then put the argument into first underscore name explicitly by writing first underscore name equals Dean. And you can see that when I run this function, we get the exact same result as above, so the order doesn't matter. So you may already prefer this type of syntax as it enables you to put things in different order and you can quickly see what object is being passed in to each parameter. And one of the main reasons to use keyword arguments is that it makes it very clear what each value means. You don't have to worry about order and it takes away a lot of that thinking. Now we also have the ability to mix keyword and positional arguments. But there are a few considerations that we need to take into account and be mindful of. So for example, if I call the welcome function and pass in Dean as the object, which we know would be based on position as we're not explicitly placing the parameter name, followed by a comma, and then put last underscore name equals Taylor, you can see that we print out the same result as above. And this is by using a mixture of positional arguments, i.e. the first item, and then keyword arguments, i.e. the second argument that we've placed in this function. But what if I do this the other way round? You can see that when I call welcome, and then inside parentheses put first underscore name equals Dean, followed by a comma, and then we try to put a positional argument, so if I just put Taylor, you can see that we run into a syntax error, telling us that the positional argument follows a keyword argument. And this is something that we're not able to do. Keyword arguments should always follow positional arguments. And you can have as many positional arguments as you want to begin with, but as soon as you place a keyword argument after a positional argument, you could then no longer have any positional arguments that follow a keyword argument. So keep this in mind. The easiest thing to do is either use positional arguments or use keyword arguments. That way you will avoid running into this syntax error. Now the final thing I want to cover with respect to parameters and arguments is the concept of a default value when working with arguments. So far we haven't defined any default values and we would expect a user or a program to pass in an object into the parameter names. But we can use what are known as default values that indicates to the function that if no argument is passed into that parameter name, then the default value will be passed into the function during the function call. And the way we define a default value is by using the assignment operator within the function definition header. And there are a few points we need to be mindful of. So let's see an example. We'll take our welcome function and we'll assume that a user will be passing in an argument into first underscore name. We can then have the comma and then define last name, but rather than assuming that users will pass in an argument to last underscore name, we will put equals, then inside single quotes we'll put the surname Smith. So what this means is that we can now call this function and we need to pass in an argument into first underscore name, but we don't necessarily need to pass in an argument into last underscore name. If we don't, for example, if I call the welcome function and just pass in the string Dean, you can see that we now get hello Dean Smith, how are you? And this is simply because we haven't passed in an argument into the last name parameter and therefore the default value of Smith is then passed in. Now if I did pass in an argument into the last underscore name parameter, It will not take Smith as the default value, and it will then take the argument provided. So putting Taylor as the second positional argument in this case would then print out, "Hello Dean Taylor, how are you?" And just note that if you are defining default values for specific parameters, these need to come after non-default arguments. In other words, if we were to put first underscore name and assign this a default value of Dean, and then put a non-default parameter as last underscore name, you can see that we run into a syntax error telling us that non-default argument, i.e. last underscore name, is following a default argument, i.e. first underscore name, which has the default value of Dean. So if I place this first underscore name equals Dean after the last underscore name non-default argument, we would then no longer run into that error. So let's summarize parameters and arguments. Functions can have parameters which are basically variable names that can then be used in the function body. We can pass in arguments into those parameters when we call the function. Now the way we pass in these arguments can be based on position, so we simply need to pass in the argument that relates to the order in which they've been defined as parameters, or we can pass in keyword arguments which assigns the value to a specific parameter name, in which case the ordering in which you pass them into the function call does not matter. You can also define default values for your parameters, for which if we don't pass a value into it when calling the function, the default value is taken on board and we won't run into an error when we call the function. So lots to digest with respect to parameters and arguments, but hopefully this is giving you an idea as to the dynamic nature of functions. Practice creating your own functions, define different parameters, and utilize these parameters inside the code block of your function body. Try using a combination of positional arguments when calling the function, keyword arguments, or mix both. And we'll be using this syntax and capability extensively throughout this course going forwards. So try to get a solid understanding of what we've just covered, and you'll be in a great position for the projects that we'll be covering shortly.